Welcome to the Houdini HOULY Challenge Series. So, SideFX is holding a challenge where artists create a piece per day based on a daily topic every day for the month of July. I have decided to take on the challenge and also record and edit all of my work so that you get to see the process behind it. I'm doing this because I like a good challenge. So, let's get into it. Today, I'm quite excited. Today is feathers, and I've been waiting for feathers ever since we did the fur one. After the fur thing, my mind was opened up to a whole bunch of possibilities, and I wanted to try a feather system based on the fur system because I thought it could be something very interesting. And so, as I said in the previous videos, I sacrificed drool and scales for today. So, this one hopefully is a very good piece, I hope. I've been giving it a lot of thought, I've been writing down some ideas. I was so excited about today that I even made a new intro. Also, we're halfway through, so that's cool. Just past the halfway mark somewhere there. This has been a lot of fun, but I would like to finish it up now. So, last few entries, I'll put all I have into it. We'll see how it goes. So, straight into the time lapse. One of the homies over on Instagram, Crispy Chips, shout out, he asked me, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, how do I go about my problem solving in Houdini? It was for this one. He asked me, how did I figure out how to make procedural feathers, without breaking Houdini? And it comes down to breaking something down, understanding how it works, and then figuring out how you can add to it. The fur system in Houdini, right? You can have fur that follows the shape of a body. And I figured, what happens if you had to replace the fur with feathers? Now, that was a theory at first.
But hey, that's just a theory.
Alright, that was just an idea. And so what I did was, I went into Houdini, and I made a sphere. Then I added some fur to it, and then I looked at what each one of these are. And so I looked at it closely, and I checked out the attributes that are on it, and I checked out things like points, primitives, all of those things, and discovered that it's just a curve. That's all it is. It's a curve with some special attributes, and it just happens to be in a hair gen system. So then I figured, what would be the best way to take a curve and turn it into a feather? So that's when I started on the procedural feather system. So if you have a curve, how would I make it look like a feather? Well, it would need to sort of follow this kind of shape, and that would be a good start. So I had the idea that if this is a curve, it's made up of points. So I thought, what happens if you had to take these points and in the direction away from them, add more points? Let me just do this over here. So you could go from a line to something like a line with some points out on the side, and then you could just connect it to the middle, right? And so that would be the start of a feather if you do that a lot. And then based on curve U, because you know that this middle part is a curve, you could maybe taper the size of these. So you could go from something like this to something like this, right? And then I figured you would need to kind of push them forward. So you would go from something like this. And so this requires two things, right? Before I get any further. This would require, if you had the curve over here, it would require knowing what's perpendicular to it, and it would also need to know what lies tangential to it, so what follows the shape of the curve. Because with those two things, what you can do is, firstly, with the perpendicular side, figure out these fronds, right? You can figure out the direction to put fronds. And then with the tangential direction, you could figure out how to do something like this. And then you would need to add variation, right? So then you could end up with something like this. And so I thought, okay, that's cool, right? I could go from a curve to what looks like a feather. But then I would need this to be able to be rendered by the first system. So that would mean that I would need whatever the first system uses as attributes. And one of the things it uses was something called width, at width. And I noticed that if you change the width attribute, then the hair either gets thicker or thinner. So all I had to do was move those attributes, this width attribute, onto each of these little fronds on the feather, and it would render as hair. And so all you're doing is basically creating hairs on each hair. And you know, it maybe sounds weird, but if you look at a feather, that's pretty much exactly what it is. It has a spine, so to speak, that thick middle area, and then it has a bunch of these thinner pieces coming off of it that look like hairs. So if I could turn one curve into a feather, then surely all I need to do is loop through all of these and turn each one of them into a feather. So each one gets turned into a feather, right? And so that was the idea that I went with. How would you take a hair system and groom it and make it look like fur, and then convert it to a feather system? Okay, so I've disabled all of the hair, so I just have this weird looking owl staring at me, making me very uncomfortable. But I disabled it because it slows down my computer a lot. So I prepared something for you just to show you how this works. So here I have the idea behind it. So you have a curve, and you set up a normal direction that's perpendicular to it. Fortunately, the curves in the hair system do this for you. So you can see here that I have these normals, but in the actual hair grooming system, this gets created for you, which is so useful for like the concept that I had. So I polyframe to find the tangential direction that I was talking about, so it follows the shape of the curve, and I output that as forward. So I resample the curve for more points. I then define the spine thickness, right? So the thickness of this curve based on curve U, so a value from 0 to 1 based on where you are on the curve. And you can see over here that controls that spine thickness. Then I create a noise that is based on position, so that each feather has a bit of variation to it. Then I have this long set of code. Now, this code started out very simple, and I kept adding to it. So I don't think that I knew exactly what I was doing coming into this. I was experimenting a lot figuring this out. So I'll go through it very quickly. Basically, you find that tangential direction. You find the reverse of it, because I was having issues with my feather facing the wrong way. And then I basically just create some curves and multipliers so that you can control down at the bottom with these curves over here, the shape of the feather. This randomizer, large noise, and variation, it's all just randomization that gets fed in so that each feather looks a bit different. This iteration only works when you're running in a for each loop. I can use the, I'll show you. If you drop a for each, say a for each name primitive, and you say create meta import node, if you plug this into the second input of a wrangle, you can call upon this iteration. So each curve that I feed into it would have a different iteration, so it would have a different value, which would mean each feather would be different. I define a position 1, position 2. You can see that it's actually simple. It's just v at p plus n, v at p minus n. So what I'm doing is I'm figuring out the direction away from the feather in either direction. So to the left of the feather, to the right of the feather, then adding points based on those positions, and also adding a point at the current position, because I don't want this connecting to the actual central curve. I want this to be a separate curve, right? I want each one to be a separate curve. I set some attributes because these need to be used later on. This is mostly for the hair system, but I can show you, like, if you remove most of the stuff, it still works. So then you have two add prims. So these create the fronds pointing away from the spine. So that gives you this, and I'll actually show you if you remove a whole lot of this code, that it's not as complicated as you may think. It might break because I'm not being exactly precise about what I'm removing here, but you can remove that. And if you remove pretty much most of this, you could remove this, you could remove this line, except you see, it just gives you that feather shape, and I can control it here with curves. The rest of it is all just variation and some attributes. So don't like be despondent by that, because it's not as complicated as it looks. The one thing that I did remove that I maybe shouldn't have is that forward thing. So you can see over here, if I say plus forward, it'll move the side up, right? So the side moved up a bit. I would do it for both of them, so plus forward on both. And so that's that tangential direction that I was talking about, where it moves up. I have controls for all of that, so I can control how much it moves up. So the distance that it pushes forward, right? So you can see that it becomes very steep. I can also control the width of the feather. So this super thin feather is useful for the feathers around the beak. But anyways, once you have that, and I'm just going to undo all of this, I do some separate calculations on just the fronds. So you can see I separate the fronds, and I do these calculations over here. Basically, it's just to give it some curve and to move them individually a bit so that there's more variation. You merge it together, and if you polywire based on that width attribute, you can see that you end up with what looks like a feather. Now, you don't polywire it when you put it into the first setup, because the first setup doesn't use polygons, it uses curves. So you can settle with just this over here, and it'll do the rest. And this is basically just hair. It's a thick spine part with thin hairs coming off of it. So you can take this, and I turn it into a feather system. So this was like the first iteration that I did. In the hair gen, I go into it, and I say that all of the hairs coming into this run what I just showed you for each of the curves coming in. So I can show you what that looks like. This was first iteration, so it's not great, but it works. So if I create a sphere, and then I create a guide groom, so that just generates some curves, and let me just hide this silly looking owl, right? Generates some curves for me. I feed that into the guide groom, and the guide groom goes into my feather system. Feather system takes a moment, but generates some of these feathers, and of course they look weird initially, because you need to fine tune a lot of the settings. So I do things like set length. So I do a guide process on these hairs to set the length. So I make them longer. And then in here, I can set this to single pass so that I can test out a single feather without having to check all of them. So you can see this one looks a bit messy, it's very wide. So I reshape it. I go into my settings over here, change the distance, change the forward distance, and then, all of these things to make it look a lot better and more like a feather. So that looks a bit more like a feather. Oh, and I can also show you softness now. I think this one, this one has softness. So if I push it up, the feather becomes softer, right? That's what that softness one does. So then, if I switch off single pass, it does it for all of the hairs. And they're pointing straight out, but what I can do is I can groom this. So I can do a guide. I'll just do a guide initialize so that you can see. Guide initialize is basically just adding, it's a wind, right? It just adds wind, just so that your guides don't start straight up. And so now it generates a whole bunch of feathers. And maybe these feathers don't look great and there's not enough randomization, but this was first iteration. But when you mess around with it, it starts to look good. So that's just the example one that I showed you there. The actual one, okay, so I'll go layer by layer. I have this first hair gen, and it's defined by zones that I paint on the owl. So I have my owl, and each one I paint different zones. So this one you can see is called fluffy muzzle. This one is soft under eye, long chest, flat head. This one's like eyebrows, head long horns, filler. This one's brows. Just brows, right? Straight up brows. And then I feed that into these various networks. So this is just the filler. This is kind of like a soft undercoat of feathers. And you can see I added a bunch to this. I added this thing on the side over here where I can paint onto my owl different colors. Transfer it onto here. Not as color though. I transfer it as highlights. And then I multiply it over here. So I can paint on colors onto my fur. And it has to be a primitive attribute because that's the attribute that the fur system picks up. So you can use this primitive attribute, and then you can actually fetch it in the renderer in Redshift. So it's that soft undercoat, and then these fine feathers around the eyes. And let me re-enable my owl as well. Okay, so you can see he's looking kind of ridiculous right now. He looks like an old man. And my computer might start struggling, so it might prioritize Houdini over my recording, in which case my voice will start cutting out and I'll just go silent, but I'll show you the setup. So here's the first one where I actually use the feather setup, right? You can see over here that I have these curves on the head, and these are pretty simple, right? These are just guide grooms, and then I brush them back. And so he's got this nice little slick back hairstyle, guide initialize, guide groom, so that I can smooth it and cut any areas that were by the eyes. I lift them slightly because the feathers were going under the geometry. And then I run it through my setup. And I'll show you single pass again, so I can show you a single feather. This made it easy to work on the feathers because I could see what each feather would kind of look like. So then each one of the hairs gets turned into feathers, and I do that same color thing. So once again, I'm painting onto the original geometry and then transferring it and then multiplying it by the base color. So that's the first feather system on the head. Over here, you can see over here that it's more of a messy guide system that I used. And then that guide system gets fed into that same feather system. When I started, I looked at some reference images. So this is the type of owl that it was based on. They're called eagle owls. And so when I looked at it, I saw that it had these very fine feathers and I could get away with using fur, right, in those areas over there. Let me just see. Yeah, okay, I can draw in it. So as you can see, he has this sort of soft feathers over there. And so I figured that those wouldn't need to be feathers. Those could just be fur. And so I got away with using fur there and there. I then saw that he had these flat feathers on his head. So those were fine. I did those next. Then I did the body feathers, these over here. And you could see that he also has the sort of ruffled look over here. So I copied that as well. And then those were the only ones that I had initially set up. Obviously the body ones extend to the back. So those are the same over there. But what I didn't take into account was that if I included the eyebrows as part of the head feathers, it would be difficult to groom them to look good. So what I did was I sort of separated this feather system over here, these eyebrows and beak. I keep calling it eyebrows, it's not really eyebrows. Yeah, that eyebrow area, that brow area, I separated. And then I also separated this over here, the sort of soft white feather. And so I ended up with a lot more feather systems than I expected. And this is a bit of a tip if you're working with fur. Try to separate the areas of interest, because this is an area of interest over here. And this is an area of interest over here. So it'd be good to have separate systems for them so that you can tweak them more finely. Things like this, you can have a very general setup. Same thing with the top. But then for these long ear type horn feathers, what you want is, once again, a separate setup. So yeah, that's what I did. I then separated that. They end up with these long feathers on top and also the fluffy feathers on the face. You can see that these ones I used a much finer feather. So I set this up once and then I could use it everywhere. And yeah, so that's all of the feather setups. Then another thing that I did was added this background. So this background over here, this grid, which is an image I found online. What you can do is you can completely blur it. So I was basically just using it for the colors that it has in it. So I did a blur of color in here because that kind of fakes the idea that your background is blurred out. And you combine that with depth of field. But what this does is it adds lots of interest. It's a very cheap way to add a lot of interest. That's another thing. My owl is just a head. And he's bald at the back. So let me show you some really flattering shots of him. I'll bring those up. Right, very majestic. Very cool. Just a floating head, right? There's this one. It's just indecent exposure. He's bald at the back. So I did this to save time, of course. If I were to have spent time on the back, firstly, it is memory wasted because I already knew what camera I was going to have. That's another tip. Try to set up your camera early so that you know what's going to be in shot. Unless you're working on a bigger project, then you'll figure out camera angles afterwards. But if you're working on a very short-term thing, figure out your camera angle first, so that you know what you can hide and what you need to focus on. So I knew you wouldn't see the back of him, so he's naked. And here's one without feathers, where he's just got his eyebrows and he looks like an old man. And then there's one with the face of determination. Look at that. Look at that focus. So yeah, you combine all of those feathers with that background and you end up with this. So a couple of things that I'm going to mention. If you're using a background like I did, this very cheap method, try to match your light sources. So I saw that there's a light source over here, so light source from this side makes a lot of sense. I saw that there's a very soft light coming from over there, so soft light over there. And then the HDRI I saw that the background was quite a warm color, a warm shade, so I used the same shade HDRI on my actual owl. And then, to make it fit in with the background, add some volumetrics. So volumetrics are just like basically fog in the air. It's that sort of that haziness that's in air. You know, we kind of assume that air is just see-through or transparent, whatever it may be, but it's not. There's particulate matter, so there's mist or whatever it may be, and that really adds realism. This helped blend the actual owl into its background, and you can see the feather system, how it ends up adding a lot of interesting details. So this you can see over here is all just normal fur. These little bits over here, all of this soft fur over here, that's all just a fur system. Here you can see the feathers that I set up. All of these are feather systems, and it's quite low res. If I was doing this for a bigger project, I wouldn't use such low res feathers, but I needed my computer to not die, so I used low res feathers. You can see over there, all of the randomization makes it quite hard to detect that this is actually just the same feather. And over here, you can see that this feather is very different from this long one over here, and that's just based on the length of the actual feather. Like, short feathers appear way different to long feathers. Another tip, this isn't actually the final, a compositing tip that I'll share with you quickly, is to reduce saturation. So this owl was quite saturated. I reduced saturation slightly, and that helps with realism. There's a slight improvement in realism just because of the color profile. The owl on the left should appear more realistic than the owl on the right. And you may feel differently, but you can see this is the only compositing I did. A slight grain to it, slight contrast changes, slight saturation changes in the eyes, and then basically desaturating the whole image very slightly. But yeah, you know, the rest of it was all very basic. It was just his eyes and beak and all of that. The actual model was also very simple. It's basically just two spheres stuck together, VDB combined, and then retopoed. Obviously you sculpt in this area here, but actual owls without fur are terrifying. I was going to make an actual, like, anatomically correct owl, and then I realized that it's not necessary. I can just use this, which is not how an owl looks at all, guys. This is very cute compared to how an owl looks. But yeah, I discovered that owls are terrifying creatures, and they look like aliens, and they probably are. And so I settled for this very round owl so that I didn't have to put as many feathers. So once again, cheating the look as much as you can. It's the way to go. Like, if you want to put out good quality work in a short period of time, you have to take smart shortcuts. You don't want to cut corners on important things. You want to cut corners on the things that people wouldn't even see. So you want to cut corners on things like the back of his head. You want to cut corners on that background. Anything that looks good for a final render, prioritize that. Once again, all of these tips are not for studio work. Studio work is different. There's different requirements if you're working in a studio environment. That's just if you're working on something like this challenge and you're trying to put out really good work really quickly. Make sure that you're not focusing on minutia, on pointless details. Maybe you spend 15 minutes on the shape of the beak, then 15 minutes on the back of the head, then 15 minutes on the background. You know, all of that adds up into hours. And at the end of the day, you don't realize those things, you don't notice them. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents. If you want to take a look at this feather system more in depth, I will attach this file. I would suggest you go through it. It's pretty interesting. You might notice in the time lapse, I use another code editor. I use Visual Studio Code. You can see over here, I had my code in here. I have a Vex plugin so that when I do something like add prim, it gives me some information as well. So there's a plugin for Vex that you can get for Visual Studio Code, and you can code in here. So this is when you get a bit more comfortable with Vex, when you don't need to see what your code's doing, you just need to see your code. So this is quite nice. Thank you for watching this one. I was really proud of this one. I think it's probably the best work that I've put out in this HOULY challenge. And so hope you liked the render as well. Hope you liked this video. And thank you for watching once again. I'll see you next time. Bye.